Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In January 1988, a film crew descended deep into one of Mexico's most extensive cave systems for a 9-day underground expedition. Sistema Huautla sits in Oaxaca, Mexico, and is one of the deepest cave systems in the Western Hemisphere. The system is accessed through an entrance called Sótano San Agustin, which leads down through a series of vertical drops and passages to depths that require multiple days to reach. The cave is so vast and complex that serious expeditions require establishing underground camps at various levels to allow exploration of the deeper sections. In late January 1988, a sizable crew of cave enthusiasts entered Sistema Huautla with an ambitious plan. They would descend to the Sala Grande de la Sierra Mazateca, a massive chamber deep within the system, and establish a 9-day underground camp. The expedition was primarily supporting the Huautla Project, a documentary film about cave exploration in this remarkable system. The crew made their descent through Sistema Huautla, navigating the series of rope drops and passages that led deeper and deeper underground. The crew had rigged complex rope systems with rebelays, knots, rope pads, and bolts to navigate the various pitches. They carried all the equipment and supplies needed for a 9-day stay in the cave: food, water, sleeping gear, filming equipment, and camping stoves for cooking meals. Once they reached their destination chamber, they established their underground camp and settled in for their extended stay in the darkness. For the next few days, they kept on filming and exploring even deeper into the cave system. Everyone took turns preparing meals for each day. One day, Bill Steele was assigned the cooking duty. He pulled out one of their MSR Whisperlight camping stoves, a popular lightweight stove commonly used by backpackers and spelunkers. The stove was fueled with Mexican unleaded gasoline, which is extremely volatile and flammable, similar to Coleman fuel or white gas used in camping stoves throughout North America. Steele began the routine process of preparing the stove to cook dinner for the crew. He pumped up the pressure in the stove's fuel tank, a necessary step that forces the liquid fuel through the burner, where it vaporizes and ignites. This is a procedure that thousands of adventurers perform safely every day. But something went catastrophically wrong with Steele's stove. The moment he finished pumping pressure into the tank and flicked the lighter, it detonated. Not a flare, a violent explosion, a compressed firebomb of gasoline vapor that erupted point blank in the cramped underground camp. The explosion sent burning gasoline spraying in all directions. In less than a second, Bill Steele was fully engulfed in fire. The darkness turned into chaos. Steele stumbled backward, a human torch, screaming as liquid fire crawled up his back, wrapping around his arms, eating through clothing like acid. His teammates lunged at him, but nothing worked. He was shouting and thrashing as the flames consumed him, the pain immediate and excruciating. One of them tried smothering the flames with his jacket. The fire blew straight through it. Another threw water from bottles. Useless. The fuel kept burning like sticky molten plastic, spreading instead of dying. Steele's voice was no longer even words, just raw animal panic. Finally, one teammate tackled him to the ground, forcing Steele face down into the cave mud, while another used soaked gear bags and bare, blistering hands to physically smother every inch of flame. And in that final desperate attempt, the fire died. But the damage was already irreversible. Steele's back was cooked raw, and his right hand destroyed. These weren't minor burns that would heal in a few days. These were second and third degree burns. The injuries to his hand were particularly gruesome. The skin was literally hanging in tatters from his palm, exposing the raw flesh beneath. In that moment, one thing became brutally clear. If they didn't evacuate him immediately, Steele wasn't making it out alive. But here's the terrible reality of their situation. They were deep inside one of Mexico's most extensive cave systems, multiple days' travel from the surface. There was no way to call for emergency evacuation, no helicopter rescue option, no ambulance waiting at the entrance. If Bill Steele was going to get medical treatment, he would have to climb out of the cave himself. The crew administered what first aid they could, with the limited medical supplies available in their underground camp. They gave Steele Tylenol 3 for the pain, a prescription painkiller that would help, but was nowhere near adequate for the level of agony he was experiencing. 2 volunteered to accompany Steele on his exit from the cave. They gathered essential gear and began the ascent, leaving the rest of the crew to continue with the expedition or break camp, depending on the circumstances. The route out of Sistema Huautla was punishing under normal circumstances. It involved climbing numerous vertical rope drops, some of them massive, plus navigating difficult horizontal passages and challenging climbs. Steele would be attempting this ascent with severe burns covering his back and his right hand essentially destroyed. Every movement would be agony. The first major obstacle they encountered was the gorge, located just above their camp. Under normal conditions, the gorge involved some swimming through underground streams and negotiating wet passages. But the expedition had experienced rain on the surface, and that water had filtered down into the cave system, swelling the underground stream to dangerous levels. Where there had been easy swims on the way down, there was now a raging current powerful enough to sweep a person away. Steele and his 2 companions had to cling desperately to the walls, finding handholds and footholds to make their way against the current. For Steele, with his badly burned hand, gripping the wet rock was a torture. Halfway through their ascent, they encountered 2 expedition members who had been making their way down to join the main camp. These late arrivals had fortunately noticed the heavy water flow and had taken the time to re-rig some of the rope drops to avoid the worst of the flooding. Steele began the series of rope climbs that would take him back to the surface. The first major pitch was 77 meters, 253 feet, of vertical rope climbing, then 35 meters, 115 feet, then 8 meters, 26 feet, then a massive 60 meter, 197 feet climb, then 15 meters, 49 feet, then an even more massive 110 meter, 361 feet climb, and finally a truly enormous 150 meter, 492 feet rope climb, nearly 500 feet of vertical ascent while suffering from severe burns. And those were just the major rope drops. There were also 17 shorter rope climbs scattered throughout the route, plus several arduous face climbs in a section called the Fool's Day Extension, climbing moves that required using hands and feet on the rock face. Exactly the kind of activity that would be agonizing with burned hands and back. The pain Steele experienced during this ascent was beyond imagination. The Tylenol 3 they had given him was completely inadequate for injuries this severe. He occasionally screamed in pain as he climbed, the agony overwhelming his ability to stay silent. But somehow, through sheer determination and willpower, he kept climbing. The ascent took 11 hours of continuous climbing through pain that would have broken most people. 11 hours of using burned hands to grip ropes and rock. 11 hours of his injured back rubbing against equipment and cave walls. 11 hours of pushing through agony that made him scream, but never made him quit. When Steele finally emerged from the cave entrance and reached the surface, he had accomplished something remarkable. He had climbed out of one of the deepest cave systems in the Western Hemisphere, while suffering from 2nd and 3rd degree burns that should have incapacitated him completely. Steele was immediately transported to a hospital where he could receive proper treatment for his burns. The medical staff cleaned and dressed his wounds, administered adequate pain medication, and began the long process of burn treatment and recovery. The doctors confirmed he had suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns on his back and hand, injuries that would require extensive care and healing time. Remarkably, despite the severity of his burns and the brutal 11-hour climb through Sistema Huautla, Steele would suffer no permanent damage from the incident. On December 15, 1988, 3 cave divers descended into Emerald Sink in Florida for what should have been a routine dive within their certification limits. But when their leader made a fatally wrong decision at a critical junction deep in the cave, 2 divers would face an agonizing choice: follow their experienced leader deeper into the flooded maze, or trust their own instincts and abandon him to save themselves. Emerald Sink sits in Huautla County, Florida, part of the extensive network of underwater cave systems that make the region a world-renowned destination for cave diving. The sink is the entrance to a complex system of flooded passages that connect to other sinks and springs throughout the area, creating an underwater maze that extends for thousands of feet in multiple directions. On this particular December day, 3 divers gathered at Emerald Sink, all holding basic cave certified credentials. The entry-level certification for cave diving that comes with strict limits on depth, penetration distance, and diving parameters. The group was led by Bill Cronin, who reportedly had somewhere between 100 and 125 cave dives under his belt. His 2 companions were less experienced, but trusted Cronin's leadership based on his dive count. Cronin was using an advanced equipment configuration called side-mounted twin 80s. 2 independent scuba tanks mounted low on his hips in what's known as the British side mount fashion. This is a complex setup that requires constantly switching between regulators and monitoring 2 separate tank pressures. His 2 companions were using more standard dual manifolded double 80s, where both tanks are connected and share the same regulator system. The 3 divers descended into Emerald Sink and began their penetration into the cave system. They were following a guideline that had been previously installed by other divers, which would theoretically lead them safely into the cave and back out again. The dive plan was to penetrate for about 800 feet, 244 meters, to a depth of 150 feet, 45 meters, or for 20 minutes, whichever came first. But here's the problem. Everything about this dive plan violated the parameters of our basic cave certification. Basic cave divers are supposed to stay within 100 feet of depth, 30 meters, use only 1/3 of a single tank or 1/6 of doubles for penetration, and avoid decompression dives entirely. This group was planning to go 50 feet, 15 meters deeper than their certification allowed, use 1/3 of their doubles instead of 1/6, and conduct a dive that would definitely require decompression stops on the way back out. But Cronin apparently had a habit of pushing beyond his certification limits and encouraging others to do the same. He had been repeatedly warned by instructors, including his own basic cave instructor, to complete his full training before attempting advanced dives. But he had ignored those warnings and continued diving beyond his certification parameters. The 3 divers made their way through the flooded passages, following the existing guideline deeper into the system. They passed one line junction where multiple guide ropes met, marking a decision point where different passages branched off in different directions. They continued past this junction, going deeper into the cave toward their planned turnaround point. At 150 feet, 45 meters deep, and roughly 800 feet, 244 meters into the cave, Cronin signaled to his companions that they had reached their limit and it was time to turn around. The 3 divers reversed direction and began their exit from the cave system, following the same guideline back toward the entrance. When they reached the line junction they had passed on the way in, they made a critical decision. They chose to follow a line that was marked with exit arrows, standard cave diving markers that point toward the nearest exit. This should have been the correct choice. Exit arrows are specifically placed to guide divers out of cave systems safely. But as they continued following this line toward what they believed was the entrance, Cronin suddenly signaled to his 2 companions by flashing his light to get their attention. He indicated that they were going the wrong way, that the line they were following was not leading them back to Emerald Sink. His companions were confused and concerned. They were following exit arrows on the guideline, which should have been leading them towards safety. But Cronin was their leader, the one with over 100 cave dives, and they trusted his experience over their own judgment. Despite their misgivings, they turned around and followed Cronin back into the cave toward the line junction. When they reached the junction again, Cronin pointed into a different passage, a deep tunnel that actually led to clear-cut sink, some 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters, away in a completely different direction. He indicated that this was the correct route back to their entry point at Emerald Sink. But Cronin's companions were now genuinely frightened. They checked their air gauges and realized their air supplies were running dangerously low. They had already been underwater for a significant amount of time, had reached depths of 150 feet, 45 meters, and didn't have the air reserves necessary to make another wrong turn. They were certain the line marked with exit arrows was correct, and that Cronin was making a fatal error in judgment. They tried to communicate this to Cronin, tried to convince him that he was wrong about the route. But either Cronin couldn't understand what they were trying to tell him, or he was so convinced of his own judgment that he refused to listen to his companion's concerns. The communication breakdown in the flooded passage, combined with Cronin's apparent certainty that he was correct, created an impossible situation. The two companions were now faced with a terrible choice. They could follow their leader deeper into the cave system toward clear-cut sink, burning through what little air they had left on what they believed was the wrong route. Or they could trust their own instincts, follow the line marked with exit arrows, and abandon their leader to whatever fate awaited him in the flooded passages. It was a decision that haunted them, but survival instinct won out over loyalty. The two divers made the agonizing choice to split from Cronin and follow the line with the exit arrows. They turned away from their leader and swam toward what they believed was safety, leaving Cronin alone in the cave as he headed deeper into the tunnel toward clear-cut sink. The two companions made it back to the entrance at Emerald Sink, but they were in critical condition. Their air supplies were nearly exhausted, and they hadn't had enough air left to complete the required decompression stops on their ascent. They had been forced to make an emergency ascent, risking decompression sickness, the bends, to avoid drowning from lack of air. Fortunately, they had left oxygen bottles at the surface as a contingency, and they immediately began breathing supplemental oxygen to help off-gas the excess nitrogen in their bloodstream from the deep dive. Despite skipping their decompression stops, they reported no symptoms of decompression sickness, though they had come dangerously close to a very different outcome. But Bill Cronin wasn't with them. He was still somewhere in the flooded cave system, alone and following what he believed was the correct route back to Emerald Sink. A recovery team was immediately assembled and sent into the cave to search for Cronin. These were experienced cave diving rescue specialists who knew the Emerald Sink system intimately. They followed the passages systematically, checking every branch and tunnel for any sign of the missing diver. The recovery divers found Cronin's body approximately 300 feet, 91 meters, from the entrance to Emerald Sink, at a depth of 117 feet, 35 meters. But here's what was particularly tragic about his location. He was in a pocket in the ceiling of the cave, while the guideline at that point was down at 145 feet depth, 44 meters. Cronin had become separated from the guideline and had apparently been trying to find it by searching along the ceiling of the passage. Cronin's depth gauge read 160 feet, 48.7 meters, indicating he had unknowingly descended another 10 feet, 3 meters, after separating from his team. Investigators concluded he then swam approximately 200 feet, 61 meters, deeper into the cave, heading toward clear-cut sink, a completely incorrect direction. When recovery divers checked his equipment, his tanks showed only 150 pounds per square inch in one and 350 pounds per square inch in the other. Critically low, barely enough for a few breaths at that depth. He had essentially run out of air while lost inside the flooded passage. A more alarming discovery followed. Both of his regulators were found significantly out of adjustment. The ambient bleeds were clogged, meaning they would have breathed poorly at depth, forcing him to exert extra effort just to inhale air. This would have accelerated nitrogen narcosis, a state of cognitive impairment caused by breathing nitrogen under pressure. At 150 to 160 feet, 45 to 49 meters, narcosis is already expected, but struggling to breathe intensifies it rapidly. This explains his irrational decision at the line junction. His companions were correctly following exit arrows, the most reliable indicator of the way out in cave diving, but Cronin, heavily impaired by narcosis, insisted they were going the wrong way. He then swam off alone, heading nearly 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters, in the wrong direction. His backup lights were also found with low batteries, confirming poor overall equipment maintenance. Only his primary light was functioning. The incident was the result of multiple preventable factors: diving beyond certification limits, poorly maintained equipment, regulator malfunction, narcosis, and overconfidence. Cronin's experience had given him confidence, but not discipline. His two companions were forced to make a critical decision: follow him into probable death or trust their own judgment and leave. They chose survival. Cronin's body was later found in a ceiling pocket, separated from the guideline and completely out of air, likely searching blindly for an escape route in his final moments.